Situation for Evergrande worsened. Chinese police detain company's wealth management staff. How hardworking are Chinese workers? Can they work harder? With a high unemployment rate, are Xi Jinping's repressive policies effective? The Chinese regime is in a lasting and insuperable legitimation crisis. It's all covered in today's China Truths. Situation for Evergrande worsened. Chinese police detain company's wealth management staff. Police in a southern Chinese city said they have detained some staff at China Evergrande Group's wealth management unit in the latest trouble for the heavily indebted developer. A statement by the Shenzhen police on Saturday said authorities took criminal coercive measures against suspects including Du and others in the financial wealth management, Shenzhen, company under Evergrande Group. It was unclear who Du was. Evergrande did not immediately answer questions seeking comment. Media reports about investors' protests at the Evergrande headquarters in Shenzhen in 2021 had listed a person called Du Liang as head of the company's wealth management unit. Evergrande is the world's most heavily indebted real estate developer, at the center of a property market crisis that is dragging on China's economic growth. The group is undergoing a restructuring plan, including offloading assets, to avoid defaulting on $340 billion in debt. On Friday, September 15, China's national financial regulator announced it had approved the takeover of the group's life insurance arm by a new state-owned entity. A series of debt defaults in China's sprawling property sector since 2021 have left behind half-finished apartment buildings and disgruntled homebuyers. Observers fear the real estate crisis may further slow the world's second-largest economy and spill over globally. How hardworking are Chinese workers? Can they work harder? Recently, the remarks of Li Jieqi, the leading live broadcaster in China, have caused huge controversy and widespread discussion. Chinese people have also been reflecting recently, as workers, have Chinese worked hard? The most direct indicator of whether a worker is working hard is the number of hours worked. It just so happens that the National Bureau of Statistics of China publishes the average weekly hours of urban employment every year, and the earliest data available is 2001, which also happens to be the first year after China joined the WTO. By interpreting the data, it is not difficult to draw four conclusions. 1. Working hours fluctuate, and fluctuations are positively related to economic development. When there is pressure on economic growth, working hours will gradually decrease due to layoffs and other reasons. The most typical example was during the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009. When the economic situation is good, everyone is willing to work more overtime to make money. 2. Excluding fluctuations, Chinese people have actually been working harder and harder over the years. In 2001, the average weekly working hours was 44.9 hours. By the latest statistics in 2021, the average working hours reached 47.6 hours, a cumulative increase of 2.7 hours in 20 years, which is equivalent to half an hour more work every working day. 3. Basically, people all over the country are working overtime. Calculated based on the standard working hours of 8 hours a day and 5 days a week, working hours of 40 hours or less a week are considered normal working hours. But since this statistics became available, Chinese have worked at least about 45 hours, with an average of more than 1 hour of overtime per day. This shows that people across the country have been working overtime for at least 20 years, and they are working more and more overtime. No wonder every Spring Festival gala sketch has a classic line, "Busy, everyone is busy, it's better to be busy." 4. Since 2016, Chinese working hours have entered a stage of steady improvement. At this stage, China's GDP growth rate is declining. After entering this period, the workload has not declined but is increasing, so the term involution has become popular. At this point, it is not difficult for us to understand why the remarks during the live broadcast caused huge waves. Because most people across China are working hard, and they have been working harder and harder in the past 20 years. Can Chinese workers work harder? Then a further question arises, can they work harder, and what is the upper limit? At this time, they cannot simply compare themselves vertically. It is necessary to discuss through horizontal comparison. Using the data we could find, we chose statistics from the European Union, the United States, and South Korea for comparison. First of all, as an old developed economy, the EU's statistical data is indeed consistent with our intuitive impression. It is relatively leisurely, and even the per capita working hours have declined slowly in the past 10 years. The United States has been relatively stable, settling in the 41 to 42-hour range. If compared to Europe and the United States, Chinese workers do deserve a May Day labor medal. Of course, as pursuers, Chinese people have never expected the kind of retirement life in Northern Europe with less work and more money. A more relevant reference is Japan and South Korea, which are close neighbors in East Asia. Due to the lack of Japanese data, Korean statistics are selected for comparison. South Korea was indeed one of the hardest working countries in the world. In the 1990s, their average working hours per week reached an astonishing 55 hours. However, with the gradual increase in per capita GDP and under the Chaebol economic model, South Korea's average weekly working hours have entered a long 30-year downward path. According to the current trend, within a few years, South Koreans will be like Europeans and Americans, also lie flat, which should be beyond everyone's awareness. Back to the comparison between China and South Korea. In 2018, China's per capita working hours surpassed South Korea for the first time, becoming the country with the most prominent working hours among major economies. From this perspective, there is indeed not enough room for Chinese workers to make further efforts. In addition, considering that China's per capita GDP is currently around $13,000, which is similar to South Korea's level in the early 20th century, there is indeed an endogenous necessity to further exchange hard work for higher per capita income. Based on this starting point, the upper limit of per capita working hours can be raised to 50 to 53 hours, an increase of 2 to 5 hours from now, which means an average of 0.5 to 1 hours more overtime per day. Increasing working hours is not actually a way of economic development to be proud of. Since the United States has the longest statistical period available, we have collected data for more than 80 years in the United States. Except for the wartime economy of World War II, the average weekly working hours in the United States is surprisingly stable, basically fluctuating around 40 hours. However, the economic achievements made by the United States in the past 10 years are obvious to all. Relying on increasing labor productivity is a proven optimal solution for economic development, rather than blindly increasing hours. At this point in the analysis, we can draw a conclusion: for Chinese workers, perhaps due to the necessity of social and economic development, the per capita working hours do still have a certain amount of room, but there is not much water in the time pool. What has to be pointed out here is that young people may face a more complicated work environment in the next few years, so it is recommended to prepare themselves mentally in advance. Thanks to this social hotspot, Chinese people can start from the labor force, a factor of production, and take an in-depth look at the economic development momentum. Workers are already working very hard and will most likely work even harder. How to adapt and optimize, instead of denying or even making fun of the hard work of workers, is not only worthy of reflection by live broadcast internet celebrities, but also worthy of re-examination by the consumer industry, manufacturing industry, and the entire society. With a high unemployment rate, are Xi Jinping's repressive policies effective? China is facing a huge unemployment problem. The jobless rate for people aged 16 to 24 hit a record high of 21.3% in June. Following such shocking data, the Chinese government has promptly decided to suspend the publication of urban youth unemployment rate. The jobless situation in China is roughly the same as in the Middle East on the eve of the Arab Spring. According to Ho-Fang Hung, a professor of political economy at Johns Hopkins University, the high jobless rate among the young people in China would mean a problem for the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. In a recent op-ed article written in the New York Times, Hung claimed that the Chinese Communist Party-led government is well aware that the group of educated, unemployed youth in big cities have the capacity to challenge its authority. After all, this is how the CCP itself was born. For decades, the party state's legitimacy has relied on economic growth and rising living standards, but those goals are now in jeopardy. Instead of meeting the needs of disaffected youth by creating new jobs and opportunities, the communist leadership has escalated their authoritarian repression as its main policy in response to the worsening economic crisis. This is not the first time that the communist regime has faced the dilemma of urban unemployment. This stubborn disease has recurred over the past 70 years, but it has either been contained through political repression or alleviated through favorable economic developments. After the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, farmers left their dilapidated villages one after another to find jobs in big cities. To restrain such migration, the government has introduced new regulations that prevent citizens from accessing social services outside their registered place of residence. With less competition from rural job seekers, the urban residents could have more secure employment. By the 1950s and 1960s, new shocks to China's economy and demographic structure once again raised the threat of youth unemployment. China's economy faltered due to the disaster of the Great Leap Forward and the loss of Soviet aid, and a generation of baby boomers in China's cities and towns were about to graduate into a deteriorating job market. In 1966, then CCP leader Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution, which ultimately caused so much unrest. So Mao changed course and launched a nationwide down-to-the-countryside movement, forcing an entire generation of urban youth to rural areas. In the late 1990s, state-owned enterprises, the pillars of the economy in the Maoist era, experienced large-scale layoffs during the wave of market reforms. It once again threatened urban employment. Then the Asian financial crisis has complicated the situation, with protests by laid-off workers and retirees from state-owned enterprises in depressed industrial cities in northeastern China. In 2001, China saved the day by joining the World Trade Organization, which brought a lot of foreign investment and jobs. Now, China has entered this cycle again, and the government has unsurprisingly responded with crackdown. Professor Hung said that, this time, the Communist Party seems to have no policy cards to play. And as the boom period ends, it will be increasingly difficult for China to escape its economic predicament. China's economic growth has slowed significantly since the early 2010s, and the economic rebound after the COVID pandemic lockdown has not met expectations. At the same time, the ever-expanding higher education system is sending more and more graduates to society, and the boring factory occupations of the past can no longer satisfy them. Instead, many recent graduates have been turning to the fast-growing technology, property and tutoring industries to find jobs. But since 2021, the Chinese government has cracked down on these three industries to curb what the leader Xi Jinping calls the disorderly expansion of capital. Last year, e-commerce giant Alibaba laid off more than 10,000 employees. Country Garden, one of China's largest real estate developers, laid off more than 30,000 employees. A top education company in the industry laid off 60,000 people in 2021. The Chinese government is also adopting the same old approach. As early as 2018, Xi called for a campaign to send the urban young people to the countryside with renewed appeals every couple of years. Even if urban youth are genuinely interested in heeding the call, it's no longer the countryside of their parents' youth. Arable farmland has been shrinking. Hung said that, if the authorities do not stimulate household consumption or loosen its grip on China's private sector, high urban unemployment will persist. In recent years, many disillusioned young Chinese people have joined an anti-work movement known as lying flat, using laziness as a form of silent resistance. A Peking University economist estimated that if those who are voluntarily lying flat are included, almost half of China's young people may be jobless. Questions such as these have led to speculation that the CCP's control is under threat, but such speculation is premature. From late imperial times to today, sporadic protests have rarely constituted a substantive challenge to the Chinese government. Protesters' demands were often directed at local officials. Only in rare cases did protests become a serious problem when disillusioned intellectuals united isolated protests into organized movements demanding fundamental changes in the system. Professor Hung said that no such threat has emerged yet. Aware of these developments, the communist government has cracked down harshly on intellectuals. Rights lawyers, feminists, activists, And even young Marxists have been arrested or had their organizations disbanded. New technologies such as facial recognition, widespread security cameras and cell phone tracking give the government greater ability to monitor the actions and thoughts of individuals. From the CCP's history, it is clear that these actions are at least partly an attempt to contain the political consequences of economic deterioration. Economically strapped authoritarian governments in Myanmar, Iran, Venezuela and Russia have all brutally suppressed mass protests. The Chinese regime has spent the past decade perfecting its repressive infrastructure, and it now has little reason not to do the same. The Chinese government appears intent on using repression as its primary policy tool in response to the economic slowdown. This may prevent threats to the communist regime, but it will certainly further stifle the country's economic vitality, thereby plunging the party into deeper troubles. Professor Hung believes that the tug-of-war between increasingly disaffected young people and a ruthless and insecure regime will determine not only China's political trajectory but also its economic future. The Chinese regime is in a lasting and insuperable legitimation crisis. The lasting economic downturn in China and the myriad social problems the Chinese regime confronts cannot be papered over by Xi Jinping's prominence at the BRICS meeting or other international fora. The Chinese regime's problems are multiple but the result of a fundamental cause. At root, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, is illegitimate, so it is in a lasting and insuperable legitimation crisis. This is the argument in the article "The Chinese Regime is in a Legitimation Crisis," published September 14, by Mr. Bradley Thayer. Mr. Thayer is the Director of China Policy at the Center for Security Policy. The CCP is an illegitimate polity for China as perceived by the diaspora, free intellectuals and media, and the clear majority of the Chinese people. This central reason is that its ideology, Marxism-Leninism, is divorced from China's history, civilization, and political culture, the framework for the legitimacy of a regime, which strengthens and validates it. The cause of the illegitimacy is the Marxist-Leninist ideology of the Chinese regime. The ideology is a bankrupt one that advances a failed model of totalitarian control over the Chinese people and which is divorced from the traditional Chinese governing principles. This ideological tension has the potential to cause a legitimation crisis in China. The legitimation crisis has the potential to cause the CCP's overthrow. As a product of Western intellectual thought, the CCP lacks even the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911, who were foreign, Manchu rather than Han, but who ruled according to China's dynastic ideology, which is at the root of China's permanent ideology. Thus, they were able to maintain power despite their foreign nature, prodigious unrest, and foreign interventions. The CCP's purported legitimacy is rooted in economic growth. But the days of economic growth are past. China's official growth targets have been trending lower over the past decade as policymakers sought to control the country's growing debt burden and stimulate domestic consumption. This depressed level of targeted growth demonstrates that Mr. Xi is failing in his effort to restore pre-pandemic levels of growth even as he is successful in further centralizing his power. The CCP's illegitimacy also generates great insecurity for Mr. Xi and the current leadership and opens an avenue to the CCP's fall. Xi's employment of the greatness of Han civilization while simultaneously contending that an imported Western ideology, communism, is necessary to rule China is contradictory and incoherent. In the CCP's version of history, the century of humiliation from the First Opium War to the CCP's victory in 1949 was a horrible aberration. Now, under the CCP and Mr. Xi, in particular, China is poised to regain the position it had always enjoyed. This conveys the historical inevitability of China's emergence as a superpower and its inevitable victory over the United States. The narrative that the CCP and Mr. Xi advance is significant because it informs the world how they perceive themselves and expect to be perceived, as an eternal hegemonic power and acknowledged as such by all other states. While the differences between Mr. Xi and Hitler are great and manifold, they share a common tie. Whatever Hitler's motivations, he did advance the nearly paradoxical point that the Germans are superior and yet everywhere downtrodden. Mr. Xi's message is the same. He has a sense of inferiority as he constantly informs the Chinese people that they are great under the CCP and yet have always been taken advantage of by Europeans, Manchus, Mongols, Japanese, and Americans. That reveals a great insecurity in Mr. Xi's and the Chinese regime's conception of China. Certainly powerful, but not powerful enough, and indeed, not good enough to supplant the West. The CCP's genesis was Lenin. It was nurtured by Stalin and the Communist International, Comintern, and later supported by the West, first as a balancer to Soviet power and then as a source of manufacturing and investment. The Chinese people have recognized that to accept communism in China requires the rejection of China's political principles of unity, dynastic government, avoidance of chaos, and respect for the people as a foundation for China's polity. A Chinese polity requires the acceptance of the traditional political system and the rejection of imported ideologies. The fact that Mr. Xi, as the leader of the CCP, and the party as a whole embrace a Western ideology means that they are simultaneously incoherent and profoundly insecure regarding their legitimacy. Mr. Xi's rule in China has proven that communism does not have the solution to creating a modern and just polity. Grafting a Western import to define and govern China was certain to generate ideological and political incoherence for the people. The query of Chinese intellectuals in the diaspora should be why the party does not listen to the people, and Chinese political philosophy and Mencius require good rulers listen to the people, bad rulers do not. Mr. Xi is advancing a totalitarian government with an ever stronger tyrannical state. There will be no listening to the people, and consequently, the party will abandon the people. Moreover, there will be no socialism with a human face as with the Prague Spring in 1968 or a more tolerant interpretation of communism. As the Book of History, an old Chinese classic, says, "Heaven hears and sees as the people hear and see, and heaven sees as my people see, heaven hears as my people hear." Therefore, it is incumbent on the diaspora in Taiwan to demonstrate to the Chinese people that communism is a fetter of China's greatness, it is a brake that will keep it from achieving China's potential. Only by overthrowing communism will China be able to realize the greatness of its civilization and be a positive force in global politics. Don't forget to leave a comment in the section below to share your opinions on today's topic with us. Make sure to like and subscribe to see more interesting topics from China Truths.